When Vladimir Putin became president of Russia at the turn of the 21st century, his country had not yet recovered from the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the chaos of the Yeltsin years. Putin's vision was to build a strong modern state similar to other major regional powers, one that would play a global role without attempting to be the superpower that it had been as part of the USSR. For this purpose, he sought to avoid conflict with other countries and to build mutually beneficial relationships. He even expressed an interest in joining NATO. But the US had other ideas. It had no desire to make NATO into a club of friendly nations, nor to discard it as obsolete, not even after the disappearance of its apparent reason for existence, namely the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Instead, the US saw NATO as a tool for US imperialism and domination, in this case, to control the powerful community of European nations. But this community was beginning to question the need for NATO after the end of the Soviet Union. The US therefore needed a new threat to replace that of the Soviets. Otherwise, member nations of NATO might no longer see the benefit of such a costly military alliance, nor accept to host US nuclear weapons on their soil while yielding part of their sovereignty to the US over the control of such weapons. For this reason, the US rebuffed Russia while exploiting its peace overtures by cajoling it into withholding its UN Security Council veto from authorization for invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. In the meantime, the Americans also violated pledges they had made during the dissolution of the Soviet Union and began to expand NATO membership eastward to the Czech Republic, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Croatia, and Albania. This left only Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia as former East European Soviet republics that had not become part of NATO. The choice of these countries is not arbitrary. These four remaining non-NATO countries form a shrunken geographical bloc at the extreme far east of the European continent, and it includes most of Russia's European borders. In other words, the pattern of NATO expansion can be described appropriately as encroachment. It is an attempt to isolate and threaten Russia. But why? After the end of the Soviet Union, Russia made every attempt to build peaceful and constructive relationships with the US and Europe. Unfortunately, Russia's vision was not the same as that of the US. The US vision was defined in 1991 by US Undersecretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz and became known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. Wolfowitz was a member of the neoconservative political movement which believed that the U.S. should use its overwhelming military and economic power to dominate other nations, and especially to crush potential regional or global rivals. The neoconservatives have always been aggressive warmongers, and unfortunately, they have maintained their power over U.S. foreign policy, regardless of which party is in the White House and/or Congress. By the second decade of Putin's leadership in Russia, it was becoming clear that cooperation was of relatively little interest to the U.S. The war against Russia's ally, Syria, put to rest any thought of negotiation or accommodation. The U.S. goal was to destroy the existing Syrian government and install one that would be obedient to the US. This was unacceptable to Russia, which supported its ally. Russia and the US therefore carried on a vicious proxy war against each other, even though they avoided direct confrontation in the conflict. But an even more important confrontation was the one that soon followed in Ukraine. In 2013 and 2014, the US spent billions of dollars overthrowing the elected pro-Russia Ukrainian government and installing a right-wing anti-Russian government allied with some of the most racist political groups in all of Europe. This resulted in a gradual civil war between the new Ukrainian government and its ethnically Russian minority, primarily in the eastern portion of the country. The US, on the other hand, wanted to further isolate and threaten Russia by making Ukraine a NATO member and placing US nuclear weapons right on Russia's border. Obviously, this was as unacceptable to Russia as the placement of nuclear weapons in Cuba was to the US in 1962, when the world last came close to the use of nuclear weapons. In reaction to these aggressive US actions in Ukraine, Russia supplied weapons and intelligence to pro-Russian populations there and moved its troops next to the border. Then, as the US began to amass weapons and foreign mercenaries in Ukraine in 2022, Russia's Ukrainian allies declared two independent republics, and the Russian armed forces invaded in order to protect its strategic interests. Where will this lead? Russia has demanded a solution that assures a neutral Ukraine that is not a NATO member and which respects the rights and wishes of the ethnic Russian population in Ukraine's eastern provinces, who overwhelmingly prefer independence or unification with Russia. My guess is that the US will prefer instead to destroy Ukraine as it did Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria through years of vicious fighting, supported by US arms and money, with the aim of bleeding Russia dry, while forcing its NATO allies to pay for this war and to enforce subservience to US imperialism. But if Russia falls, we know that China is next on the list. In fact, all the targets of imperialism know that they are on the list, and their only hope is to help each other to resist. China has already declared solidarity with Russia, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, and other countries, and they're collaborating to overcome the sanctions regime that the US is imposing against them. There are signs that such efforts may weaken the mighty US dollar. If the dollar collapses, no weapons will save the United States. But let us hope that the rest of the world can at least save itself as the US empire fades into history.